Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Cropper here. Going to be having a bit of a discussion with Doug from the Rational Capitalist, and we've been talking for a minute, so we're going to join into a rolling conversation, and we're talking about, Doug, why don't you go ahead, and I'm going to look up that thing from Binswanger, and you go ahead and introduce yourself and say something while I'm looking that up.
Sure. Well, we had an introductory conversation a few days ago, and in that, I had approached you and said, let's do a deeper dive on some of the on immigration and the topic of immigration, and because it's really where my issues started with the ableftivist community, and particularly the people at ARI who are espousing, I thought, a preposterous position with regard to a dangerous position with regard to immigration, and it's caused so much angst and consternation within our circles as we all fight over what should we do about immigration. And so when I started looking for and researching this topic and writing about it, and so I wanted to kind of do a deep dive with you about it and see what you think, and then also talk about some of my writings and sort of where this all started for me. And I was just saying to you that one of the places it started was reading Harry Binswanger's articles on immigration, particularly, and now to his credit, he's the only ableftivist type guy that's put anything in writing. All these other people just do podcasts and hysterically scream into mics on podcasts. He actually wrote something down, so to his credit, great. What he wrote though was I thought absurd, preposterous, dangerous, and when he said that America should have nothing more than a welcome sign on its border, literally a fully open borders position where there are no checkpoints, no border, no nothing, just a welcome sign. And in fact, I think he even advocated issuing an apology to immigrants for.
Yeah, I'm showing it on screen so the audience will be able to see this. Amnesty for illegal immigrants is not enough. They deserve an apology.
And so I saw that, and I wrote, there's two pieces on my blog that specifically go through his articles. It's called Why Objectivists Really Disagree on Immigration, Part 1, and then I have a Part 2, which was a follow-up, because he actually changed his position without telling anyone or admitting it. But by implication, he changed his position. And so, as I went through this and I started researching other, I thought, wow, that's kind of a libertarian take, man. Like, there are no borders, what? And I started reading some libertarian authors like Hans Hermann Hoppe and even Lou Rockwell and von Mises and Rothbard, people like that who are more in the libertarian camp, who I thought would also be sort of anarchist with respect to borders. And in fact, they're more objectivist-y than the objectivists. They're the ones who are saying, no, we absolutely need a border. You have a right to a border, so on, sovereignty, and have a much deeper understanding of it.
Where in Ayn Rand's philosophy does this principle come from, except when people asked her about immigration and she said, of course I'm in favor of immigration. If I couldn't have immigrated here, then I would be dead. That would be a hypocrite for me to, right?
Right.
That's the source of it, right? Is there any place else in her philosophy that she advocates open borders?
No, of course she wouldn't advocate open borders.
I don't know of any other place that she says that immigration is obviously a value to human life because she's alive. Is that? Do you have anything else?
No, I don't.
Okay.
In fact, I think you're right. You're right that was the extent of what she said about it. And
now I have a response to that, which is, what if we wouldn't have let her in and the Soviets would have killed her in some horrific gulag? Who would be at fault? On whose bloods would the hands be? On whose hands would the blood be?
Right. And in fact, I wrote an entire article addressing, someone had written, someone I think from Cato had written an article called, Ayn Rand was an immigrant, or something like that. So it's sort of like, how dare you criticize open borders when Ayn Rand would have died, right?
Yeah.
And so I wrote a whole article addressing this issue. It it was by Shika Dalmia. And so I analyzed the flaw in that argument. And, you know, in essence, you know, the fact is that when you have an immigration policy, just like in war, there's collateral damage. So we don't say, well, we shouldn't have dropped a bomb in Japan because we might have killed a potential Ayn Rand. You know, of course, you know, when you defend yourself, there's collateral damage involved. And so it's not our fault, you know, and it's a great value that she was let into all of us. Obviously, we admire her greatly and she did great things,
Now,
just like a lot of immigrants did. But that's not an argument in itself
now
for
see
advocating national defense.
Yeah, that's where I would step in and I would say, okay, we let you in. You should be grateful that we let you in. It wasn't your right to prance in here.
Right.
You should be grateful that the laws of a country allowed you to come onto their borders. I mean, a country doesn't have a right to have a border. This is insanity. What is the military?
Well, so, you know, stepping back, so I started really thinking about this issue and saying, well, wait a second. Because, you know, one of the points he makes was that I thought was preposterous was he says, well, the government has no more right to ask someone for identification on the border than they do to go onto a city bus and ask a citizen for his papers. You know, the government can't arbitrarily stop a citizen and say, where are your, you know, papers, please? So how can they do it on the border? And of course, he's completely dropping the context of an international versus an intranational border. And so that seemed just on its face to be absurd. You know, do we deal with Somalia or Iran or North Korea or technology transfers? You know, when companies sell sensitive military technology abroad, do we concern ourselves with who they can sell that stuff to? Do we just say, well, free trade so they can do whatever they want?
Well, moreover, what did our fathers and grandfathers do with the Russians who wanted to invade this country? We had a Red Scare and we cleaned the place out and we were very careful about that. And that's why we've inherited the country we have, because they didn't let the Soviets infiltrate everything.
So right, and you know, so what I did, and this gets into some deeper epistemological ground as well, because I see a lot of objectivists approaching this issue the wrong way in terms of just how they think about it and how they think about politics. The better question to ask is not, do individuals have rights? The question to ask is, what facts of reality give rise to the need for rights? And why do we want a government? Why do people, citizens, landowners form a government in the first place? What's the whole point of having a government and granting that government the ability to monopolize the use of force? Well, one of the reasons is that there are bad people out there who want to invade your land and kill you and change and overthrow your institutions and your government. So the whole reason we have a government in the first place is to protect ourselves from foreign invasion. That's called national defense.
You know, Ayn Rand should have said, I'm in favor of letting women immigrate. Damn it to hell.
Yeah.
Because that would be fine, you know? That'd be just fine. And that's always been true. Human cultures have always traded women, but they'd never trade men, because that man coming over could end up being the king. He could be smarter and more handsome, and he'll just take over the whole damn tribe.
Right. And so, you know, the whole reason why the reason why we have a government in the first place is to protect ourselves from foreign invasion. And to say something like, you know, in his article, he sort of switches from saying, well, you know, no border. He then finally acknowledges, well, you know, if someone's a terrorist or a criminal or has a disease, you know, we obviously can't let them in. And my first thought was, well, how would you know that? Without a border or a check or some sort of investigation of a prospective immigrant, how in the hell would you know that they have a disease, that they're a criminal, that they're a terrorist? Like, how would you even know that? So, okay, so if he's acknowledging then that we do need a border by implication, and we do need these checks, then he agrees with us, doesn't he? Doesn't he agree that there? And then the argument is just
then let's call him out right here. Harry Binswanger, give us an answer. Can we have borders or not? And if we can, then back down from this ridiculous position that you've taken with your Forbes article. There's my public statement to Mr. Binswanger.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's a flat out contradiction. So he changes his argument, and really then it just becomes a question of degree at that point. Because if you then acknowledge that, yeah, we need a border, we need to assess or analyze the threat, the potential threat coming from prospective immigrants. And I want to talk in a second about what I think those threats are, because I have a broader conceptualization of that. If we all agree that we need to check on these things, then we're just really arguing about the extent of that check. You know, what can we ask those people? What are we allowed to do? And my answer is that in a national, with respect to national defense, which this is, immigration is a subset of national defense. You're assessing whether someone's a threat to your country. And unlike a good being imported into the country, when you import people, they can change your institutions, they can change your society, they can overthrow the government. Some states have populations of a couple million people. If we allowed unlimited immigration and you had 5 million people show up, which is nothing in China, right? They just send over 5 million people and take over a state. They get 2 Senate seats. Well, what if they start doing that in all the states and they take over? I mean, this is just like kindergarten level thinking, right? It would be so simple for a hostile country to just start sending people in and taking over legislatures and governments and state legislatures and putting senators and Congress people in power. Even if they weren't intent on blowing stuff up and shooting people, they could just simply take over just through sheer numbers. So the idea
his ideal world is just let the largest group, the largest and most aggressive group, have it. Have everything.
Yeah, and if India has 1 billion people, China has 1 billion people. How hard would it be for them to send 5 million people, 5 million prisoners? They capture 5 or 10 million people, send them to North Dakota.
Now, what if they turn America into their dumping ground, like Britain did for Australia? Turn it into the dumping ground for vermin, and just send us all their worst criminals.
Of course,
and we
did that,
and we have open borders.
And so the whole point of the government is to sit back, and we grant the government this sort of power to defend our borders. And by the way, if these same people who urge us to nuke Iran and engage in some of these wars in the Middle East as they've done in the past, if we're concerned about procuring intelligence and strategizing militarily and defending our interests overseas, why wouldn't we be concerned about people coming into the country, people in the border? I mean, shouldn't we be as concerned or more about people who are literally on our border walking into the country? But the point is that we have this national defense, and the threats that they analyze change over time. So the threats that existed in the 1790s, when the American Congress passed the first Naturalization Act, were different than the threats in the 1880s or the 1930s or the 1970s or even now. And it's not just the threats that emerge overseas and the nature of those particular types of threats and the ideologies and motives underlying them. It's also the way in which our own society changes. So the more that, when the founding fathers thought about immigration, they considered America to be, quote, the land of toil, unquote, where it was sort of self-selecting. If you came over here and you weren't willing to work, you were going to die. I mean, there's no welfare, right? So now our society has changed so much that, when you come over here, you get, as we know, you get free everything, right? And so, what kind of burden are you placing on other people when you allow immigrants to come in who aren't necessarily sponsored? So in other words, when you're assessing the quote unquote threat that a person or a group poses, you have to consider the full context, which is, the threat that they potentially present, as well as the society which we live in addition to which we have a culture that currently is anti-Western, that is urging immigrants not to assimilate on principle. That, to be pro-American is, a form of what, white privilege or white supremacy. And so, they're explicitly being told and urged not to assimilate. So just at the very time we have the worst possible culture, to assimilate massive amounts of people, we're being told by this group that we need to bring in as many people as possible, which is, again,
or as many people as feel they want to come.
yeah, as many people as they want to come. So this is a very dangerous idea, and it really flies in the face of, I think, objectivist thinking, which is, the reason why, if you, when you have individual rights as, a citizen of our country, it also means that you have a government that protects your rights and protects you from the dangers of, foreign aggressors.
Yeah, but we don't really have individual rights in the United States. What we have is we have the right to a fair trial. We have a right to, all these things are written down. Like if you really get down to it, the United States government will protect a certain list of rights. That's what they've announced. And so what does it mean to have individual rights? If you just take it as a platonic floating abstraction, all human beings just have these rights. What the hell do you mean? You mean just by nature they have rights to what kind of freedoms? I mean, the only way to really say what that right actually is to write it down and have a law that has an actual policy of what that means in the real world. And that means a government of some kind. So rights are protected by governments. So to say that this individual, this global individual, can flit and float around the world by their right is very strange, because who enforces this right?
I addressed that exact point in one of my articles where I think I called it a sort of like universal galactic tribunal. Like people's rights aren't respected out of thin air.
Yeah.
People set up governments in a self-interested way in order to protect their own rights. And so that particular group of landowners and citizens created that particular government which protects them, and they've all acceded.
This reminds me of
that and ratified that government, and so they then look out at the world and say, okay, who are the bad guys, who are the good guys, and how do we determine that? So everything flows from those people. We don't start with the principle of individual rights, this kind of, like you said, a platonic concept. We start with who are the people that have, or why did these people create this government, and what are they trying to do with it? What's the whole point? To protect themselves.
Protect themselves and their rights.
In their institutions.
Yeah, you sounded out just a little bit there. You bleeped out.
Sorry. And they create a process by which they allow other people to come into their society. There was a interesting debate around the time of the founding. When the U.S. came out of, or when the colonies came out of the feudal system in Europe, the way the feudal system worked is you were born somewhere and you had an obligation to your master. You were essentially a slave to your feudal lord, and so it was a great sort of innovation when the founding fathers and the people of the Enlightenment said, no, you're not bound to any master. When you're born, you can go. You're free to leave a society. You're free to go wherever you want. You're not, born a slave. That did not mean, and they explicitly acknowledge that did not mean that you could go anywhere you want and demand that some other group or country take you. It meant that you have a right to go set up your own country or find some other place to live. It does not mean that otherwise, you're dealing with a sort of like a forced contract and involuntary consent.
Yeah, and
you force yourself on someone else.
They had to force themselves on the Indians, but they were carving civilization out of wild territory as far as they were concerned. As far as they and the Indians were concerned, they sure traded with the Indians a lot for all the grief that they get for wiping the Indians out. It's like, we tried to show them a consensual society. They sure liked our products.
Right. Yeah, and that's like a whole other issue. Well, yeah, and I guess you could say that the Indians have a pretty good sense of what open borders does to a society,
Yeah,
right?
just let them
Uh,
come in, no matter what their beliefs, no matter what their traditions. Just let them come in. Yeah.
let them come on in. So so anyways, it's interesting though because there's this idea of mutual consent when you bring someone into your society. Of course, we also have to distinguish what we mean by allowing someone in to become a citizen and just allowing someone to come in and maybe work or something like that. So that's a distinction that needs to be made. But my bigger point with regard to all this is that when you take the perspective of starting with what facts give rise to the need to defend your border, which is that there are bad people who are not part of your society and who have not acceded or ratified your form of government, you need to protect yourself from those people, and you need a process and a policy to do that, which is immigration policy. And that policy can change from time to time depending on what the threats are. And another big distinction, which is often passed over, is the difference between individual migration and mass migration. And I kind of wanted to get your take on this too, because I think there's another epistemological point here, which is that if we deal with if one guy shows up and says, "Boy, I'd really like to come to your country," and here's my background, and the onus being on him to prove who he is and his identity. This is my background. I'm blah blah blah. I'm going to work here. Okay, great. Come on in. To restrict someone like that, who's perfectly appropriate, who may be a sponsor or whatever, I think could construed as a violation of, someone in America's rights if they want to marry that person or employ them or whatever. But if a mass group of people come...
Now wait. So living in the United States of America gives you a right to trade with or employ anyone anywhere on the planet?
No, that's not what I meant.
Well, that's kind of what they mean, right?
Yeah, it is what they mean.
They mean that your rights are violated if you can't hire any wahoo from any place, China or wherever else.
No, and so okay. So let's take a case like...
Now, where do you get the right to employ anybody from anywhere on the planet? Who enforces such a right? How could you defend such a right? That's just bizarre. Is it just the right of free association?
No, I don't think that is a right. I think when we're dealing internationally, not intranationally, between citizens who are, already acceded to the laws and have citizenship, when you're dealing with foreign nationals, you in effect have to ask for permission from your neighbors. And I mean, not literally necessarily, but through a policy. In other words, if I have a company and I develop satellite technology or a guidance system and a missile, I can't just sell that to North Korea. If I do that, I'm threatening my neighbors. I'm putting everybody at risk. If I bring in, 500,000 Islamic jihadis onto my ranch in Texas, I'm threatening my neighbors. If I dock a nuclear submarine, I'm at my port at my vacation home in the Gulf, and I allow a foreign army to dock their nuclear sub, I'm potentially threatening my neighbors. Now, in other words, when we're dealing with foreign nationals, you have to go through a process by which you're, in essence, demonstrating or showing or approved by your neighbors, because it's impossible, practically speaking, for it, if I live somewhere in Florida and a guy in California is allowing criminals into I can't, as an individual, go and defend the country everywhere.
So we set up the government. We set up the government to do that.
We set up a government to do that, and it effectively, collectively protects everyone and protects everyone's interests. And you do that, through the national defense.
Not everyone's interest, just ours.
Ours, yeah.
Who's ours? The people inside the borders. This occurred to me when I hear about occasionally there's somebody kidnapped somewhere or something, and America makes a big to-do about it, and I think, there are people inside that country that are going under the most horrific treatment all the time. And we get one citizen arrested by some prince in Africa or something. We make a big deal, and we go bring him home, and we bring some guy home from South America or some trouble he's in somewhere, you know. Why? Because he's an American citizen. He's no different from any of the other people. But those other people are now doomed to stay in that damn country, and the American citizen is whisked away off of his disaster vacation gone wrong and brought back home to magic land.
Mm-hmm.
And what is so magical about this place? It's a goddamn government that protects our rights. That's what's so magic about it. You know?
That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's a good point. So it, you know, when you approach things from this perspective, it's more clear, you know, what the threat is, how to assess the threat, and the sort of policies and procedures we would need. And what I was getting at with mass migration is, you know, if one guy shows up, it's totally different than 50,000 people showing up at once. Why? Because it takes time and effort and resources to vet that amount of people in a certain amount of time. And so when you're faced with the prospect of a mass migration, it's completely appropriate and necessary to evaluate a group based on aggregate characteristics. So it may be true that in a group of 50,000, there are 3 geniuses, and there are 5 doctors, and there are 7 wonderful people, you know, whatever. But if that group of people emanated from a civil war in the Middle East somewhere where there are jihadi radicals involved, and they're people that have no records, we have no medical records, we have no criminal records, we don't know who they are, what they're doing, and they don't speak the language, and they're unlikely to assimilate, why in the hell would we allow people like that to just dump them into some city somewhere and completely upend some community,
you know,
on the basis that these people could, you know, they could, in theory, learn to be Thomas Jeffersons. It's preposterous to think that. Now, it's true.
Now,
that's in theory true, but it's not in our interest to do something like that.
I was going to kind of object in principle and say, you know, this idea of the group versus individual immigration might be not really, I mean, we shouldn't allow any groups to immigrate. We should only allow individuals to immigrate. And so if we don't enumerate the individual, then they can't come in. I mean, that's how we started in 1819. We started checking the health of people getting off the boats. And if they were unhealthy and sickly, we put them back on the boat and send them home.
Mm-hmm.
So that was like individualizing, you know, not looking at any groups. We never looked at any groups. I mean, we did exclude some groups. We limited the number of Irish or whatever. But even when we took a group in, we still individualize.
Right.
So it is ultimately definitely about individualizing. Now, I think that we should have a pretty big, open immigration policy, because if we set up too strict of a government value test, that'll be taken over by ninnies, and they'll only allow bad people to come in. You know, now that's what they did in France. You know, they said they have a big government infrastructure to integrate Muslims, to bring only good Muslims in, and to make sure only good things are preached in the mosques, and that's going just beautifully.
Right.
So they've tried that. I'm not down for that. I think we should allow, you know, pretty much anybody who wants to come, but we've got to dismantle the welfare state first. I'm not even talking about increasing immigration by 1 iota with our current welfare state. I'm totally against this welfare state. So that is the current reality, that we pay tens of thousands of dollars for everyone that arrives here. And I'm not into that. I want them to come and produce something, not come and be a drain. So we've got to stop that before immigration. Once we get open borders, I think that we could say legally, no Muslims. I think we could set up, especially today, I mean, the founding fathers certainly wouldn't have, Abraham Lincoln wouldn't have, maybe they would have. They went to war against them in the Barbary Pirates.
Oh, I think they would have, yeah.
They might if Muslims started immigrating in large numbers and taking over America, they might have had a war. I mean, shit, they kicked out the Chinese, didn't they?
Right.
So of course they wouldn't allow the Muslims. So what am I saying? They kicked the goddamn Chinese out. So they had. Do you know we had so many Chinese
Well,
here?
we still had state-sanctioned religion in many states at the time of the founding. So it wasn't until the early 1800s when that went away. So you actually had to take an oath of fidelity to, the state religion in Massachusetts and some other states. So
Yeah.
I don't think I certainly don't think they would have allowed that.
So on whatever grounds, either on present grounds of threat or on historical grounds, I would not allow Muslims to immigrate to the United States.
Well,
So
yeah, and again, that's a contextual question. Like right now, no. Maybe in 50 years, if Muslims had a sort of reformation and there was, to a large extent, they became secularized and pro-Western the way
well,
Christians did,
th-
300 or 400 years ago, then great.
but
That's a totally different scenario. But
that's
right now,
that's
no.
why our representatives meet every year and why we reelect them and we have a news cycle and newspapers and universities we argue about and talk about these things and over time we change our policies according to the
Well, and
according to
that's why I say this policy is contextual. And one of the things that it really drives me crazy is when people try and dig into the past and say we did it this way. Everything is like sort of the Ellis Island immigration, or everything is the way we did it in this year. Though 20 years ago we did this, or 50 years ago we did this. In 1930 we probably didn't let a whole lot of Germans in, or in the early 40s. We probably didn't let a lot of Japanese in the 1940s. Um, right now, when you have civil wars going on all over the Middle East, and you have the threat of jihadi terrorism, and you have groups like ISIS and so on explicitly threatening the United States, why would it make sense to allow anyone from those regions to come into the country without knowing a whole lot about them?
Not only that, but we have a controlled experiment example in Europe. Like
Right.
It's like, what if we did let them come into an extremely wealthy, very advanced Western society? How would they act? Check out Europe, see how that's going over there. So ultimately, I think America can handle it if anybody can. I think that it's going to be a bloodbath in Europe. I think if the Muslims do come here, hopefully over the next 50 years, they will be civilized and will start reaching out and changing their home countries. So that's my best case scenario. But the possibility that they start taking over America like Europe 50 years from now is also very strong. They've sure got a lot of Muslims around the world and they're breeding fast. So,
well, part of what I wanted to also specify is with respect to this idea of national defense and how immigration fits into that. Part of that policy is assessing the extent to which, or the propensity for a certain group to assimilate and to value and uphold our institutions. The purpose of the government is defend our country and defend our institutions and not overthrow them. So you don't, I've heard some leftivists say things like, we can't have ideology can't be a litmus test. If there was one litmus test, that would probably be it, would be ideology. After all, the people that are coming here, particularly those that are going to vote or participate, and we also know, by the way, that the Democrats are trying to make it legal for illegal immigrants to vote in elections. So that's just a reality we have to face. Ideology is motive. Ideology is motive for someone to either overthrow or attack our institutions. Why? With respect to a war, we say, well, we're not going to really consider the ideology of the communists. Can't really look at the ideology of Islamic radicals.
Okay, so let's say that we have set up a system in America. We did stop bad groups from coming in right up until we stopped the Germans or whatever from coming in. Let's say that your idea of an ideology test is true, and we kept it right up until very recent times. Now that we're letting bad people come in insane ways. Now, I'm going to say that's why we have, at the end of the day, number one, free speech and free press, and number two, gun ownership. Because even assuming the worst possible disaster, they've still invaded one of the most heavily armed countries in the history of the world.
Right.
So, at the end of the day, I have many cards up my sleeves. And so it might not be as big of a disaster for us as it could be. And we should definitely defend our borders. This is pathetic for us to allow Dearborn, Michigan to be a hotspot for jihadism. It's just insane.
Yeah, it should never get to that point. I mean, you would never. Why would you even allow something like that to even form? There's absolutely no reason, no justification for it from a national defense perspective.
No, there should be an inquiry into who's responsible for those policies, and they should be tried for treason, and we should deport these people.
Right, immediately. And to see someone like the Omar become a congresswoman.
There we go. There we go. So
again, they're starting to infiltrate the institutions of our government, and this is what happens. And to say, to say that for someone like a Harry Binswanger to come out and say there should literally be no border. Getting back to sort of like that whole, it's such a preposterous and rationalistic claim that it does such damage to the credibility of objectivism. If you're just a random person saying, I wonder what the objectivist take is, I had to think about a pretty complex political problem like immigration, because it really does involve understanding, the concept of sovereignty, of individual rights, how governments form, the purpose of government, understanding economic issues, law, some history, to put this all into context. And to have someone just rationalistically say, no border. I mean, I would run from that in 3 seconds. It's so stupid. And I know that from some of my online discussions, I've been told, well, Harry Binswanger that doesn't speak for the Ayn Rand Institute. Well, he's on the board. I mean, who in the hell else speaks for him? Because they're all pretty much saying the same thing, right? I mean, who disagrees?
Just last night or the night before, very recently, Yaron Brook said, I'm the chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute, but when I get on here and blog, I'm speaking for myself. I'm not representing Ayn Rand Institute's views.
Shit.
Yeah, it's like, who does then? What are you guys talking about? If you're members of the Ayn Rand Institute, your views, if you don't believe that shit, then get the hell out of there. If you don't believe what Ayn Rand Institute should be teaching, then get the hell out of there.
Right.
Oh, now, just to make a note, Harry Binswanger and company, defend yourselves, defend your views, period, full stop, defend these views. The shit stops here, damn it. This is garbage. This is suicidal garbage. In my opinion, it's embarrassing, and when the people come to look, as you said, when they come and say, what's going on with the objectivists, and they find far left communist garbage propaganda like America should open its borders, Russia spreads that kind of nonsense because they want us to do that, not because they're going to do that. They spread feminism because they want us to do feminism, not because they're doing it.
Well, there's a further insult to injury here, which is at the end of one of his articles where he's talking about why objectivists disagree on immigration. After the stream of contradictory, rationalistic claims that make no sense and that drop context, and he says, well, the only, all objectivists really do agree that in some future sort of like utopia world, we'd have open borders, but I'm afraid that we don't have that right now, and so if you disagree with me, you've got to be a xenophobe. That's the only thing that explains any sort of dissent from my view. He literally says that. And to espouse such a superficial, unscholarly, unprofessional, rationalistic view of immigration that flies in the face of common sense, much less deeper philosophy, and then to accuse anyone who dissents from that being a xenophobe is so wrong and so outrageous. And what it's done is it ended up, inflicting something like that to people that follow him and that are sycophants of his, to then pick up that torch and start accusing anyone that disagrees with them of being xenophobic or bigoted. That's where we are. That's what happened. And that's part of what set me on this course of being not just concerned about the ARI group, but outraged by what they're doing. And to not then go back and either start writing papers, putting stuff out, being very specific about what their views are, and walking some of this back, or no apologies from them. They, in fact, more or less doubled down. And they changed their view. And, if you actually listen to Iran, he tends to change his view every 6 months. And then when you try and pin him down, he says, well, I never said that. And you have to go to minute 26:32 of podcast 375 to figure out what the hell he said. So it's, the larger point, the sort of like rationalism that's implied here. And what I mean by that is the willingness to try and deduce concretes from principles. So in this case, we have them asserting rationalistically this idea that people have rights, people have individual rights, and they start there rather than asking the question, why do we have a government? What's the point of the government? Like, why do we have national defense? What's the nature of national defense? Like, how does that work? They start with individual rights, and because they have this floating platonic formula of individual rights, they're hysterical. They can't be reasoned with because they have this universal formula, and they just keep reasserting it: individual rights, individual rights. And so, to me, that's a form of rationalism. It's like someone who says, "Well, I have freedom of movement," and you say, "Well, do I have the freedom to move my arm into your face?" Well, no. Well, okay. Do I have the freedom to walk into your house? No. Well, freedom of movement, that principle must be held in a context, just like when we talk about, lying. Should you lie? Well, you should lie to a kidnapper or to someone who's robbing you, because the principle isn't thou shalt not lie as a commandment. The principle is we live for our own self-interest, and we're reality oriented. And so if I want to preserve my own life, I need to lie to the kidnapper. Now, if I'm a religionist or a dogmatist, I say, Leonard Peikoff told me I should never lie. That's dogma. That's rationalism. You're not going back to the root of why we have a principle like honesty as a virtue. And you're holding that principle dogmatically and contextlessly, and you're trying to apply it. And so in this instance, I think that's exactly what's going on with this immigration debate, where they're taking these principles like individual rights or freedom of movement, and they're throwing them around without starting with the facts that gave rise to the whole issue of immigration. The setup of a country, the border, sovereignty, landowners, national defense, who we let in, who we don't, how we go about assessing who can come into our society, and how to do that, and how these threats change over time, which is a pretty complex topic.
Well, it's very fun and very easy to announce a principled stance on stuff and dismiss reality, and you seem very intelligent, and you seem very informed, and you seem very principled, and that's what they're trying to do, is be principled. They want to be principled and just have a principled stand.
And that's not a principled stand. It's a dogmatic stand. It's
a principled stand, but it has nothing to do with reality. Come down to reality and have a principled stand on the real shit happening in the real world, and that's a different story. My principled stand is I'm pro individual rights. Now what?
Now what?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Now pull out your guns and tanks, and let's start defending our individual rights.
Exactly. To me, that's like the deeper problem I see in objectivism. We see this in the we were talking about the election of Trump and the way the whole root of Trump derangement is this kind of rationalism where you isolate a philosophical pathology, like Trump lies, or Trump is anti-intellectual, or something like that. And you say, well, what are all the characteristics of an anti-intellectual person or someone that lies? And then you extrapolate what that could mean, and you say danger. When instead you have to say, well, all the candidates lie. All the candidates are anti-intellectual. They're all various forms of corruption. Like, let's like what powers does this person have? What is the limits of their power? What are the checks on their power? What are some of the, how are they likely to act um, given this or that, or this circumstance, and what direction are they going to tend to go? And so you start asking all these concrete questions. And what Gate had done in one of his articles is just isolate Trump's pathologies philosophically and say, can't have that. And I mean, if you wrote about Hillary's philosophical pathologies, you could probably write a treatise on that woman, or Joe Biden, or one of these clowns. They're all bad.
That's what gets to me about their criticisms of Trump. It's like, can't you talk about the great things that Trump does and says? I mean, can't you mention any good things which are amazing surprises to me? I did not think Trump was going to be this good. Like, who thought Trump was going to be this good? Like, let's talk about why these policies are actually so good. Like with tariffs, my first reaction was, okay, I'm going to have to do a video on why tariffs are stupid, And so I start looking into it and think about it and say, why did the founding fathers fund this nation only with tariffs? Why did they not have taxation inside our borders? Well, maybe I shouldn't be so against tariffs. I mean, it's going to hurt Chinese industry. It's going to force companies to relocate to America and build factories in America. Like, let me see, where's the bad side? I'm just looking and looking. So
yeah, exactly. That's another great point, which is that in some utopia world where we don't have taxation and there are no bad guys, yeah, maybe. In the real world, there are countries like China and others, that are more mixed. And, part of the job of the government is to protect us from these people. And there's levers to do that. One of them is tariffs. And in fact, it's funny because I started researching the founding fathers' views on tariffs and some of the debates. And at, near the War of 1812, Thomas Jefferson actually really believed in tariffs. He thought it was the right way to fund the government, and that it had done a lot of good. So, taxes always bad if we're good objectivists, but in the context of what's really going on here and the geopolitical threat that China poses, one lever we have to use against them is the tariff. Now, could we boycott them? Sure, I'd probably be in favor of that. But how realistic is that? Is he going to imagine him coming out tomorrow and saying, boycott, no more goods from China? I mean, we're doing $1 trillion worth of business with them a year. So if you start targeting these tariffs and at least raising the issue and the question and causing some discussion and consternation here.
He doesn't have to put the tariffs in place. He just threatens. Like he says, be good down there in Hong Kong, or else I'm going to be very mean with the tariffs. He didn't even put a damn tariff in place, and he's saving lives.
That's right. It's a way to threaten them and threaten their economic interests, just like when we embargo Iran or Cuba. We prevented goods from coming into their country, or we prevent goods from coming here, or what we did with Russia. I mean, it was the same sort of thing.
And what's the ultimate effect on our economy is that bicycles cost more because some bicycle company had to relocate back to California or Texas or something. So we pay all of a sudden more for bikes. What's the effect on their economy? Unemployment, stagnation, misallocation of resources, because they have these controlled economies. These other places in the world go through havoc when we put tariffs on them. We just adjust. Things might, we costs us a little bit of money. That's all. So I think that's another thing that we should remember when we're discussing these things is how does it affect them and how does it affect us? For us being a free country, it's just a cost. But for their controlled economies, it's really an existential threat to do these things to them. So we can really push them around with a very simple 10% tariff.
Well, another good point that's broader that you just made, I think, is this issue of thinking purely in economic terms, which is, and I saw this in Binswanger's writings on immigration, where he was essentially, and I see this in a lot of libertarian writing where they say, hey, goods coming across from Mexico, that's the same as goods going from New Jersey. People going from Mexico to Texas is the same as people going from New Jersey to New York or something like that, where they completely dismiss the context between an intranational border where there are longstanding political constitutional agreements between these areas and international borders, like between the U.S. and Somalia, or Mexico, or North Korea, or Iran, or China, or whatever. It's a completely different context, right? And so it is true, purely in economic terms, if we get cheaper T-shirts from China from slave labor, and we pay less for T-shirts, okay, we're marginally better off. All else equal, right? That could probably be true, purely economically.
If
However,
all else is equal, but I've found that not all else is equal.
But not all else is equal, because you're enriching a communist regime that's using profits, that's enslaving their own people, and using those profits to build a military with nuclear weapons pointed at our country, and
not
building
only
an architecture of Orwellian dystopia.
Not only that, but even worse, the T-shirt fades very fast, the yarn comes apart, and 1 year from now it's a rag, and you can't wear it for more than a year. So,
well, and I remember Binswanger giving a talk years ago, it was the Buy American is Un-American, where he pretty much said, hey, there's no real issue with the trade deficit, because if we buy their stuff, or they buy our stuff, they have our currency, they have to buy our stuff, it's all the same, it's just all, it's much ado about nothing. And that's not true, because when we buy consumer goods from them, like T-shirts, and they take that capital and then they don't buy consumption goods from us, they invest in our bonds, they have to invest in our assets, they invest in capital, they invest in our stock, and in our bond market and our real estate market, or whatever. So you're essentially selling off the assets of our country to hostile foreign powers in exchange for cheaper T-shirts.
Yeah, which we then throw in the landfill. As I keep saying, all the Chinese stuff they send to us is garbage, and we just throw it away and have to buy something from Japan or something. And
I'm not saying there's not such a thing as comparative advantage, or that we should absolutely be trading with other great countries. Yeah. It's to everyone's advantage. We know that. We know capitalism and free trade work. Yeah. But my point is that economic issues are not primary when you're dealing with existential level problems, like the threat of foreign countries, the threat of people coming here and replacing our population and voting down our institutions or overthrowing our institutions.
Yeah.
Getting back to immigration, cheaper labor, cheaper gardeners, cheaper T-shirts. We're not. Not only is it not just an atomistic economic calculation because of the threat that these people pose, but we also have a culture, and with a culture on the brink, due to the philosophical forces that we know are at work right now, bringing in legions, millions of people that don't necessarily value America or American culture, American institutions, is suicidal. And for them to say things like, falsely generalize and say things like, the immigrant just wants to come here and work. How in the hell do you know that? That's true of some. Is that true of all? We're the ones who are saying, no, let's find out. Okay, if everybody's an individual and everybody's different, let's find out who this person is. Why are they coming here? Are they coming here for welfare? Are they coming here because they're an MS-13? Or are they coming here because they're an engineer or a doctor and want to work? Let's take the doctors. Let's send back MS-13. It's pretty simple. So, they rely on false generalization and claims about, all immigrants are good. It would be just as wrong to say all immigrants are bad. That's not true either.
I've heard him say
to find out.
I've heard him say disgusting things like the immigrants are better than the Americans who are here.
Yeah, exactly. That's even worse.
What
they're actually better than Americans, right?
I'm tempted to think that they're being paid by Soros to say this shit or something. It's really getting insane. It's really that bad. I said to my wife a year ago, I said, the left infiltrates everything, but they'll never infiltrate the objectivist movement because it's too easy for us to tell who they are, and wow, I don't know.
Well, there's association between the Cato Institute, which pushes the open borders agenda through the Koch brothers, and So maybe they're getting funding from there. A lot of the principals at that institute are foreign; they're immigrants. Um, and it's one thing to say, hey, let's have a merit-based policy where we can let in good guys, and let's streamline the process and make our process better. The current process is a horrible mess. But if we had a reform, sort of immigration reform, where it was focused on merit-based immigration, that's what you'd advocate. What they seem to advocate is no policy and virtually no policy or very limited policy. And I don't know where that, it could come from where they're being funded. It could come from them just not being Americans. I mean, I'm sort of a deplorable American. I'm a Midwestern person, and I've seen my own community completely upended through immigration. Half the city I live in is, you probably can't go in now because the neighborhoods have become so bad as a result of unlimited immigration and dumping not just 3 or 4 people, but thousands and thousands of people in one area in a way that's designed for them not to assimilate. And so our entire policy seems to be designed to, almost destroy American society. And so for them to not at least step back from where they're at and say, let's think about this. And, to have such a superficial view and then to accuse dissenters of being, bigots or, phobic in some way. I mean, it's so awful. And I'm glad that you and I are talking, and I'm glad that you're doing what you're doing, because as we said in the last conversation, we need a new generation of people to step up.
Well, what I think what we need is to wake up some of the objectivists, because 6 months ago I didn't care about any of this debate. So
yeah, when did you start seeing? Did you re-engage and start seeing the social media stuff, or what prompted you to start seeing what was going on?
Let's see. A guy named Jason. I don't know if I think he's been publicly named on my videos in the past. I don't remember for sure, but this guy named Jason kept saying to me, look, the Ayn Rand Institute is saying terrible things. And so every once in a while I would go check in with Yaron Brook, and I never heard anything terribly egregious. But then the more time went on, and the more wonderful Trump was, and I saw what a blessing he was, and then every single day on Facebook I see they hate Trump, they hate Trump, they hate Trump. Him and Amy Peikoff, Yaron Brook and Amy Peikoff, just spend all their time despising everything Trump does. And like we mentioned before, they want him to do something moral about Hong Kong, but they sneer at him for putting tariffs on. Like they can't say anything positive about Trump no matter what. And I started to say, well, what's going on? They're acting a lot more like leftists than objectivists. They seem like there is no space between leftist attitude and the objectivists. And so when I started seeing that, that's when I started really analyzing from that perspective and really starting to pick apart what they say and not accept it. I mean, I don't know. Go ahead, say something. Because I'll just go on.
Yeah, no, I understand. I mean, I think a few years ago is when I started seeing it with, and I think I don't know that Trump's administration is going to result in a lot of changes to policy, but it's certainly exposed some questions, and it's kind of demasked a lot of people in terms of like what the left's true motives are, the lengths they're willing to go to. It's also, I think, exposed some fissures within objectivism, particularly epistemologically, in how people think about politics. We see this in immigration. We see this. The big tech issue is another issue where I'm outraged by the stands that they're taking, where they're defending big tech censorship and not understanding the threat posed by companies that are engaging in fraudulent behavior and immoral behavior,
government-sanctioned fraudulent behavior.
And, right. And, so we've done some we could probably have a whole cast about that. They recently had a panel that I watched where Dave Rubin, whose career has really been threatened through this demonetization of his platform, he's on a panel with Yaron and Greg Salmieri and another gentleman who had worked at, I think he had worked at Facebook or something. And here Rubin is saying, almost begging, this is in front of the crowd at one of their conferences, pretty much begging for some sort of like moral support, for his cause and what he's saying, and what are we going to do about this? What can we do? And their answer was nothing, pretty much nothing. There's nothing you can do. And
well, what do you propose? I mean, should we go into that now? We're already
sure.
No.
Well, let me give you. I mean, we could have an hour on it, but I'll give you my 2 minutes, which is, first of all, you have to. The first thing you do is identify big tech as a moral outrage. They're, specifically, they're demonetizing and deplatforming the right disproportionately. So they're trying to shut down the right from speaking.
Well, everybody admits that, yeah.
Everybody admits that. That's in itself completely immoral. Now, the question as to whether they can get away with it and what we should do about it, first of all, these companies exist and have advertised themselves as neutral platforms, and they rely on Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which shields them from liability as long as they remain neutral. And so they built business models that garnered their executives and shareholders billions of dollars by being publicly advertising themselves as neutral platforms and having a shield of liability because they're not considered publishers. And they induced content creators, in the tens of thousands of people from right and left, a lot of right people, into building business models around these neutral platforms, who then in turn brought eyes and customers to their platforms. They then changed the rules out of thin air in complete violation of their own terms of service, which is at least a bait and switch. It's completely fraudulent. It's completely immoral. And not only is it immoral just by virtue of the fraud, they're doing it to the right because they believe they hate the First Amendment and they seem to hate the United States. And they certainly hate Trump and his supporters. So this is, I think it's a legal fraud. I think it's potentially a violation of not only the Section 230, I think it's just a generic fraud in that they bait and switched thousands of people and customers and changed their terms of service arbitrarily. They're not operating in good faith, which is, a term of art, I guess, in contract law, where if you and I sign a contract and, it says, hey, if you do a year of work, I'm going to give you a bonus on January 1st, and you do the year of work, but I fire you on December 31st. Now, maybe technically I could do that, but that's a complete violation of good faith, which undergirds all of contract law. And I'm not a lawyer, but a friend of mine who is told me that. So they're violating contract law. They're violating their own terms of service. I followed some of the lawsuits that have been launched against them with great interest. Now, let me step back for a second and just say, not only are they bad guys and immoral, but from the point of view of philosophy or from a movement like ours, we don't say something like, well, they can do whatever they want. They're a private company. That could be possible legally. That could be true. But we're objectivists. We're supposed to believe in ethics. And these people are ripening the culture eventually for government censorship. So to the extent that they're shutting down the right and normalizing that sort of behavior, they're setting cultural precedents, which desensitize people to this, where eventually, how hard is it going to be for the government to just simply say, well, let's shut down anyone who disagrees with us. I think the question is tactically, what do we do? So So the question is, these are our enemies. That's the first thing you need to do, is identify them as your moral enemy. These are leftists. They're, in fact, Peter Thiel suggested that Google should be investigated for treason, for collaborating and aiding and abetting the Chinese, and not aiding and abetting our own intelligence services, with regard to these network, this technology they're building that allows them to censor and oppress their own people. But so, all that stuff aside, these people are our enemy. And so tactically, now, at the same time, you don't want to do something like, well, let's give Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders power and control over the internet. So my solution is think tactically. You don't want to pass a law or have some knee-jerk reaction to these idiots and these evil people that ends up undermining your goal in the long run. Our long-run goal is to have a free society and to have a First Amendment and to have, a free country again. So we don't want to do anything that jeopardizes us, and we don't want to win a battle and lose the war. So yeah, I wouldn't advocate antitrust. I think that's probably too dangerous a road to advocate. But I do think you can go after them based on fraud and violations of things like the 230 exemption, and maybe even get that rescinded. And I know there's been some efforts by some Congress people to make that language in the law clear with respect to what they have to do to enable them to get to keep that shield. There's some legislation pending on that. So there's some legal things we can do that are still consistent with our view of what the government should be, which is to prevent fraud and to prosecute it, and also attack these people. And at the same time, yeah, we should support competing platforms and so on. But the least you should do is call these people out as a moral outrage and consider them evil. And on this panel, there was none of that.
Yeah,
I think at 25 minutes in, I think Yaron said something like, "Well, I guess you could condemn them." You could condemn. I won't condemn them, but you could condemn them.
Yeah, because it's private property, so they won't condemn what they're doing. I mean, we can at least speak out against what they're doing, because at least a little more loudly. Yeah, I definitely think that there's room for that. And now we should sue them on fraud grounds, and we should probably use this opportunity to talk to everybody on the right about why antitrust is so bad.
Yeah.
Rather than just run from the conversation and say, no, it's free speech, and just leave it at that with the floating idea of free speech as not even applied to reality. What does it mean to have freedom of speech when the government is sanctioning censorship? I mean, these companies have gotten so big because the government has said that they're not liable for copyrighted material that's put on their channels. So you go on and put copyrighted materials, people come on and view it, and then YouTube takes the video down, but after that it's had 10,000 views already. Mm-hmm. And YouTube's not liable for those 10,000 views. They don't have to pay the copyright owner. So that's made them rich. That's made them absolutely rich. Government-sanctioned wealth. And now, with their government-sanctioned wealth, they are censoring us. Yeah, antitrust.
And remember, we don't have a free society. I mean, we have a mixed economy with a semi-fascistic government, which, by all accounts, is threatening these companies. So they do exercise some amount of control to, look at what we saw during the Obama administration with respect to banking. That I forget what they called it, Operation something or other, where they had MasterCard and a bunch of banks were deplatforming gun manufacturers and gun dealers. And pornography purveyors or whatever. So they were deciding what they liked and didn't like, and then they were putting legal pressure, and regulatory pressure on banks to debank these people. So now, if the context were, again, let's get back to contextual thinking and contextual principles. If we had a perfectly free society and some guy out there doesn't want to put Brandon Cropper on his platform, and he disclosed that, you and I would be all for his right to do that, even though we wouldn't like him and we'd say he's a bad guy. But we don't have that. We have a situation where the government is threatening, fascistically controlling these companies through legal pressure, threats of regulation and antitrust, as well as now we're getting banks involved, where banks, which is a completely regulated and nationalized system that you really can't compete with. Then you're getting into, well, can conservatives get electricity to their house? Can conservatives drive on roads? Like, where does that go? So you have to have a more nuanced conversation when you have a mixed economy and think tactically and think, maybe we need maybe the Congress, to the extent that this isn't a national fraud and that these terms are being, and the terms of service are being changed unilaterally in bad faith, maybe maybe we need to agitate for a Bill of Rights where we say, look, if you're going to get this liability shield, here are the rules. You cannot discriminate based on political content. And here are the things very specifically that you can ban: pornography or, explicit violence or whatever, whatever the rules are. But to not have that discussion, if you're the panel talking to Dave Rubin, whose career's been, and source of income's been, he's been deprived of his source of income through this fraud, to just say, private property, what are you going to do about it? That's such a libertarian-ish, not even libertarian. I don't even think the libertarians are that anarchistic and that amoral.
Like you say, it's not just a discussion of the floating principle of private property divorced from reality. We're in a semi-fascistic system, so let's talk about the realities of our system. They hate it when you say things like that because, oh, you're going to be a pragmatist then, huh? So what does it mean to not take account of the reality around you?
Yeah, that's another misnomer. They use that term pragmatism, and I don't think they know what it means. I mean, pragmatism is the idea that you can't operate on principle, that the human mind, that's impossible for everything is so chaotic in the world and so random that, principles are bound to fail, and that's not what we mean by pragmatism. We are thinking in principle. We're the ones who are thinking in principle. We're taking the facts. Knowledge is open-ended. Concepts are open-ended. And so when you observe reality, you integrate new information and new facts, and you come up with a new theory. Ayn Rand famously, in one of her essays, actually advocated using the fairness doctrine. If you remember, in the 70s, the radio stations were going to use the fairness doctrine to try and they were using the fairness doctrine in education, not the radio station, fairness doctrine in education to silence conservatives. And she said, okay, well, if you're going to use the fairness doctrine, then why don't we use the fairness doctrine and force them to, have conservatives speak and have an equal number of right-wing people as left-wing people? And, in other words, if you're going to use that law and that's the rule right now, then why should we suffer why should we let our enemy use a rule and we're not going to use the rule? Like campaign finance violations. Well, hey, if they're gonna put Dinesh D'Souza in jail for violating some arcane finance violation or Manafort or whatever, then it threatened Trump because he paid off the hooker, and that's a campaign finance violation. Well, what about when Facebook shuts down a right-wing ad for a politician or shuts down a right-wing politician? I mean, that's an in-kind contribution to their political opponent. That's a campaign finance violation.
The problem is they own the deep state. They own all of the investigation people, all the bureaucracy that would trigger the investigation, all the people who would do the investigation, all of the judges. They own all those people.
And that's why, in my view, this is tactical. We have to step back and say, how can we fight this politically and practically in a way that's still where we can still win the war? We don't want to grant the government too much power in trying to fight back against this, but to just wave your hands and say private property is a complete denial of reality. We don't have private property. If the government can threaten people into doing something or debanking people or whatever, prevent people from voluntarily cooperating with one another or deplatform them arbitrarily, that's not a free market. That we have no recourse. So in that context, you have to fight back. Otherwise, we're all going to be saying, private property. Well, we defended private property on the way to the gas chamber because that's where we're all going if the real left seizes power someday.
Yeah, that's one thing I took exception to with Rucka and his attitude towards me. He thinks that we need to use objectivism to understand things, and he says so that we can better understand things. Is that what it's for, or are we going to understand things as we go into the gas chambers?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know really what that means. I mean, you know, reality the way knowledge works is you look at facts and then you integrate those facts into your principles. And, you know, the facts are that we have a mixed economy. You know, and in any given situation, you have to apply your principles, but you have to apply them understanding the context in which the principle was formulated, just like lying to a kidnapper.
You know, I think it's important to remember that the moral and the practical are not to be divorced. Like lying to the kidnapper, it keeps you alive, it keeps you safe, and it was the moral thing to do. So if you're doing what's practical, that was the moral thing to do.
Yeah, and if you're advocating something that's so obviously impractical and damaging to your own life, don't you step back and say, something's wrong with my thinking? Where do my think? Like if I'm advocating that, you know, 5 billion people from around the world could inhabit America tomorrow, something's wrong with that. Like, wouldn't you just something went awry in my thinking? If you know we're going to allow the Chinese military to just like walk in plain clothes into the country tomorrow, like something's gone wrong in my thought process. Maybe I should really think about this.
It's an impractical, actual view to hold, and therefore there must be something immoral about it if you're going to allow something so impractical to happen. So go back to reality and apply your principles a little better. Your open border garbage is garbage. It's just floating garbage. Not yours. I'm sorry, Doug. I don't mean to say yours.
Yeah. No, I absolutely.
Well, how are we doing? Have we covered?
Well, yeah. Let's leave it there because you're going to be on House of Sunny on this week, I believe.
Yeah. Today's about 3 or 4 days. That'll be
stay tuned, everybody. We're gonna turn the tables on Mr. Cropper and ask him the questions.
Oh boy, here we go. All right, that'll be good. All right, thanks a lot, Doug. We'll talk to you next time.
Thanks for having me as always. Appreciate it.
Yep. Bye-bye.